Chapter 4. Quote, Well, go thy way, thou shalt not from this grove, till I torment thee for this injury. Unquote. Midsummer Night's Dream. The words were still in the mouth of the scout when the leader of the party, whose approaching footsteps had caught the vigilant ear of the Indian, came openly into view. A beaten path, such as those made by the periodical passage of deer, wound through a little glen at no great distance, and struck the river at the point where the white man and his red companions had posted themselves. Along this track, the travelers who had produced a surprise so unusual in the depths of the forest advanced slowly toward the hunter, who was in front of his associates, in readiness to receive them. "Who comes?" demanded the scout, throwing his rifle carelessly across his left arm, and keeping the forefinger of his right hand on the trigger, though he avoided all appearance of menace in the act. "Who comes hither through the beasts and dangers of the wilderness?" "Believers in religion, and friends of the law and to the king," returned he who rode foremost. "Men who have journeyed since the rising sun in the shades of this forest, without nourishment, and are sadly tired of their wayfaring." "You are then lost," interrupted the hunter, "and have found how helpless 'tis not to know whether to take the right hand or the left?" "Even so. Sucking babes are not more dependent on those who guide them than we who are of larger growth, and who may now be said to possess the stature without the knowledge of men. Know you the distance to a post of the crown called William Henry?" "Hoo!" shouted the scout, who did not spare his open laughter, though instantly checking the dangerous sound he indulged his merriment, at risk of being overheard by any lurking enemies. "You are as much off the scent as a hound would be, with Horican atwixt him and the deer. William Henry, man! If you are friends to the king, and have business with the army, your way would be to follow the river down to Edward, and lay the matter before Webb, who tarries there, instead of pushing into the defiles, and driving this saucy Frenchman back across Champlain into his den again." Before the stranger could make any reply to this unexpected proposition, another horseman dashed the bushes aside, and leaped his charger into the pathway in front of his companion. "What then may be our distance from Fort Edward?" demanded the new speaker. "The place you advise us to seek we left this morning, and our destination is the head of the lake." "Then you must have lost your eyesight afore losing your way, for the road across the portage is cut to a good 2 rods, and is as grand as a path, I calculate, as any that runs into London, or even before the palace of the king himself." "We will not dispute concerning the excellence of the passage," returned Heyward, smiling, for, as the reader has anticipated, it was he. "It was enough for the present that we trusted to an Indian guide to take us by a nearer though blinder path, and that we are deceived in his knowledge. In plain words, we know not where we are." "An Indian lost in the woods!" said the scout, shaking his head doubtingly. "When the sun is scorching the tree tops, and the water courses are full, when the moss on every beech he sees will tell him in what quarter the north star will shine at night, the woods are full of deer paths which run to the streams and licks, places well known to everybody, nor have the geese done their flight to the Canada waters altogether. 'Tis strange that an Indian should be lost atwixt Horican and the bend in the river. Is he a Mohawk?" "Not by birth, though adopted by that tribe. I think his birthplace was farther north, and he is one of those you call Huron." "Huh!" exclaimed the two companions of the scout, who had continued until this part of the dialogue, seated immovable, and apparently indifferent to what passed, but who now sprang to their feet with an activity and interest that had evidently got the better of their reserve by surprise. "A Huron?" repeated the sturdy scout, once more shaking his head in open distrust. "They are a thievish race, nor do I care by whom they are adopted. you can never make anything of them but skulls and vagabonds. Since you trusted yourself to the care of one of that nation, I only wonder that you have not fallen in with more. Of that there is little danger, since William Henry is so many miles in our front. You forgot that I have told you our guide is now a Mohawk, and that he serves with our forces as a friend. And I tell you that he who is born a Mingo will die a Mingo, returned the other positively. A Mohawk? No, give me a Delaware or a Mohican for honesty. And when they will fight, which they won't all do, having suffered their cunning enemies the Maquas to make them women, but when they will fight at all, look to a Delaware or a Mohican for a warrior. Enough of this, said Hayward impatiently. I wish not to inquire into the character of a man that I know, and to whom you must be a stranger. You have not yet answered my question. What is our distance from the main army at Edward? It seems that may depend on who is your guide. One would think such a horse as that might get over a good deal of ground betwixt sun-up and sundown. I wish no contention of idle words with you, friend, said Hayward, curbing his dissatisfied manner, and speaking in a more gentle voice. If you will tell me the distance to Fort Edward, and conduct me thither, your labors shall not go without its reward. And in doing so, how know I that I don't guide an enemy and a spy of Montcalm to the works of the army? It is not every man who can speak the English tongue that is an honest subject. If you serve with the troops of whom I judge you to be a scout, you should know of such a regiment of the king as the 60th. The 60th! You can tell me little of the Royal Americans that I don't know, though I do wear a hunting shirt instead of a scarlet jacket. Well, then, among other things, you may know the name of its major? Its major? Interrupted the hunter, elevating his body like one who was proud of his trust. If there is a man in the country who knows Major Effingham, he stands before you. It is a corps which has many majors. The gentleman you name is the senior, but I speak of the junior of them all, he who commands the companies in garrison at William Henry. Yes, yes, I have heard that a young gentleman of vast riches, from one of the provinces far south, has got the place. He is over young, too, to hold such rank, and to be put above men whose heads are beginning to bleach. And yet they say he is a soldier in his knowledge, and a gallant gentleman. Whatever he may be, or however he may be qualified for his rank, he now speaks to you, and of course can be no enemy to dread. The scout regarded Hayward in surprise, and then lifting his cap he answered in a tone less confident than before, though still expressing doubt. I have heard a party was to leave the encampment this morning for the lake shore. You have heard the truth, but I preferred a nearer route, trusting to the knowledge of the Indian I mentioned. And he deceived you and then deserted? Neither, as I believe, certainly not the latter, for he is to be found in the rear. I should like to look at the creature. If it is a true Iroquois, I can tell him by his knavish look, and by his paint, said the scout, stepping past the charger of Hayward, and entering the path behind the mare of the singing master, whose foal had taken advantage of the halt to extract the maternal contribution. After shoving aside the bushes, and proceeding a few paces, he encountered the females, who awaited the result of the conference with anxiety, and not entirely without apprehension. Behind these, the runner leaned against a tree, where he stood the close examination of the scout with an air unmoved, though with a look so dark and savage that it might in itself excite fear. Satisfied with his scrutiny, the hunter soon left him. As he repassed the females, he paused a moment to gaze upon their beauty, answering to the smile and nod of Alice with a look of open pleasure. Thence he went to the side of the motherly animal, and spending a minute in a fruitless inquiry into the character of her rider, he shook his head and turned to Hayward. A Mingo is a Mingo, and God having made him so, "Neither the Mohawks nor any other tribe can alter him," he said, when he had regained his former position. "If we were alone, and you would leave that noble horse at the mercy of the wolves tonight, I could show you the way to Edward myself within an hour, for it lies only about an hour's journey hence. But with such ladies in your company, 'tis impossible." "And why?" "They are fatigued, but they are quite equal to a ride of a few more miles." "'Tis a natural impossibility," repeated the scout. "I wouldn't walk a mile in these woods, after night gets into them, in company with that runner for the best rifle in the colonies. They are full of outlying Iroquois, and your mongrel Mohawk knows where to find them too well to be my companion." "Think you so?" said Hayward, leaning forward in the saddle and dropping his voice nearly to a whisper. "I confess I have not been without my own suspicions, though I have endeavored to conceal them, and affected a confidence I have not always felt, on account of my companions. It was because I suspected him that I would follow no longer, making him, as you see, follow me." "I knew he was one of the cheats as soon as I laid eyes on him," returned the scout, placing a finger on his nose in sign of caution. "The thief is leaning against the foot of the sugar sapling that you can see over them bushes. His right leg is in a line with the bark of the tree and tapping his rifle. I can take him from where I stand, between the ankle and the knee, with a single shot, putting an end to his tramping through the woods for at least a month to come. If I should go back to him, the cunning varmint would suspect something, and be dodging through the trees like a frightened deer." "It will not do. He may be innocent, and I dislike the act, though if I felt confident of his treachery—" "'Tis a safe thing to calculate on the knavery of an Iroquois," said the scout, throwing his rifle forward by a sort of instinctive movement. "Hold," interrupted Hayward, "it will not do. We must think of some other scheme, and yet I have much reason to believe the rascal has deceived me." The hunter, who had already abandoned his intention of maiming the runner, mused for a moment, and then made a gesture which instantly brought his two red companions to his side. They spoke together earnestly in the Delaware language, though in an undertone, and by the gestures of the white man, which were frequently directed toward the top of the sapling, it was evident he pointed out the situation of their hidden enemy. His companions were not long in comprehending his wishes, and laying aside their firearms, they parted, taking opposite sides of the path, and burying themselves in the thicket, with such cautious movements that their steps were inaudible. "Now go you back," said the hunter, speaking again to Hayward, "and hold the imp in talk. These Mohicans here will take him without breaking his paint." "Nay," said Hayward proudly, "I will seize him myself." "Hist! What could you do mounted against an Indian in the bushes?" "I will dismount." "And think you, when he saw one of your feet out of the stirrup, he would wait for the other to be free? Whoever comes into the woods to deal with the natives must use Indian fashions, if he would wish to prosper in his undertakings. Go, then, talk openly to the miscreant, and seem to believe him the truest friend you have on earth." Hayward prepared to comply, though with strong disgust at the nature of the office he was compelled to execute. Each moment, however, pressed upon him a conviction of the critical situation in which he had suffered his invaluable trust to be involved through his own confidence. The sun had already disappeared, and the woods, suddenly deprived of his light, were assuming a dusky hue, which keenly reminded him that the hour the savage usually chooses for his most barbarous and remorseless acts of vengeance or hostility was speedily drawing near. Footnote: the scene of this tale was in the 42nd degree of latitude, where the twilight is never of long continuation. End footnote. Stimulated by apprehension, he left the scout, who immediately entered into a loud conversation with the stranger who had so unceremoniously enlisted himself in the party of the travelers that morning. In passing his gentler companions, Hayward uttered a few words of encouragement, and was pleased to find that, though fatigued with the exercise of the day, they appeared to entertain no suspicion that their present embarrassment was other than the result of accident. Giving them reason to believe he was merely employed in a consultation concerning the future route, he spurred his charger, and drew the reins again when the animal had carried him within a few yards of the place where the sullen runner still stood leaning against the tree. "You may see, Maqua," he said, endeavoring to assume an air of freedom and confidence, "that the night is closing around us, and yet we are no nearer to William Henry than when we left the encampment of Webb with the rising sun. You have missed the way, nor have I been more fortunate, but happily we have fallen in with a hunter, he whom you hear talking to the singer that is acquainted with the deer paths and byways of the woods, and who promises to lead us to a place where we may rest securely till the morning." The Indian riveted his glowing eyes on Hayward as he asked, in his imperfect English, "Is he alone?" "Alone?" hesitatingly answered Hayward, to whom deception was too new to be assumed without embarrassment. "Oh, not alone, surely, Maqua, for you know that we are with him." "Then Le Renard Subtil will go," returned the runner, coolly raising his little wallet from the place where it had lain at his feet, "and the pale faces will see none but their own color." "Go! Whom you call Le Renard?" "'Tis the name his Canadian fathers have given to Maqua," returned the runner, with an air that manifested his pride at the distinction. "Night is the same as day to Le Subtil when Monroe waits for him." "And what account will Le Renard give the chief of William Henry concerning his daughters? Will he dare to tell the hot-blooded Scotsman that his children are left without a guide, though Maqua promised to be one?" "Though the gray head has a loud voice and a long arm, Le Renard will not hear him, nor feel him in the woods." "But what will the Mohawks say? They will make him petticoats and bid him stay in the wigwam with the women, for he is no longer to be trusted with the business of a man." "Le Subtil knows the path to the Great Lakes, and he can find the bones of his fathers," was the answer of the unmoved runner. "Enough, Maqua," said Hayward. "Are we not friends? Why should there be bitter words between us? Monroe has promised you a gift for your services, when performed, and I shall be your debtor for another. Rest your weary limbs then, and open your wallet to eat. We have a few moments to spare. Let us not waste them in talk like wrangling women. When the ladies are refreshed, we will proceed." "The pale faces make themselves dogs to their women," muttered the Indian in his native language, "and then when they want to eat, their warriors must lay aside the tomahawk to feed their laziness." "What say you, Renard?" "Le Subtil says it is good." The Indian then fastened his eyes keenly on the open countenance of Hayward, but meeting his glance, he turned them quickly away, and seating himself deliberately on the ground, he drew forth the remnant of some former repast and began to eat, though not without first bending his look slowly and cautiously around him. "This is well," continued Hayward, "and Le Renard will have strength and sight to find the path in the morning." He paused, for sounds like the snapping of a dried stick and the rustling of leaves rose from the adjacent bushes. But recollecting himself instantly, he continued, "We must be moving before the sun is seen, or Montcalm may lie in our path, and shut us out from the fortress." The hand of Maqua dropped from his mouth to his side, and though his eyes were fastened on the ground, his head was turned aside, his nostrils expanded, and his ears seemed to stand even more erect than usual, giving him the appearance of a statue that was made to represent intense attention. Hayward, who watched his movements with a vigilant eye, carelessly extricated one of his feet from the stirrup, while he passed a hand toward the bearskin covering of his holsters. every effort to detect the point most regarded by the runner was completely frustrated by the tremulous glances of his organs, which seemed not to rest a single instant on any particular object, and which at the same time could be hardly said to move. While he hesitated how to proceed, Les Subtils cautiously raised himself to his feet, though with a motion so slow and guarded that not the slightest noise was produced by the change. Hayward felt it had now become incumbent on him to act. Throwing his leg over the saddle, he dismounted with a determination to advance and seize his treacherous companion, trusting the result to his own manhood. In order, however, to prevent unnecessary alarm, he still preserved an air of calmness and friendship. "Le renard Subtils does not eat," he said, using the appellation he had found most flattering to the vanity of the Indian. "His corn is not well parched, and it seems dry. Let me examine. Perhaps something may be found among my own provisions that will help his appetite." Magua held out the wallet to the proffer of the other. He even suffered their hands to meet, without betraying the least emotion or varying his riveted attitude of attention. But when he felt the fingers of Hayward moving gently along his own naked arm, he struck up the limb of the young man, and uttering a piercing cry, he darted beneath it, and plunged at a single bound into the opposite thicket. At the next instant the form of Chingachgook appeared from the bushes, looking like a spectre in its paint, and glided across the path in swift pursuit. Next followed the shout of Uncas, when the woods were lighted by a sudden flash that was accompanied by the sharp report of the hunter's rifle. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. Quote, "In such a night did this be fearfully o'ertrip the dew, and saw the lion's shadow ere himself." Unquote. Merchant of Venice. The suddenness of the flight of his guide, and the wild cries of the pursuers, caused Hayward to remain fixed for a few moments in inactive surprise. Then, recollecting the importance of securing the fugitive, he dashed aside the surrounding bushes, and pressed eagerly forward to lend his aid in the chase. Before he had, however, proceeded 100 yards, he met the 3 foresters already returning from their unsuccessful pursuit. "Why so soon disheartened?" he exclaimed. "The scoundrel must be concealed behind some of these trees, and may yet be secured. We are not safe while he goes at large." "Would you set a cloud to chase the wind?" returned the disappointed scout. "I heard the imp brushing over the dry leaves like a black snake, and blinking a glimpse of him just over agin yon big pine, I pulled as it might be on the scent, but 'twouldn't do. And yet, for a reasoning aim, if anybody but myself had touched the trigger, I should call it a quick sight, and I may be accounted to have experience in these matters, and one who ought to know. Look at this sumac. Its leaves are red, though everybody knows the fruit is yellow blossom in the month of July. 'Tis the blood of Subtil. He is hurt, and may yet fall." "No, no," returned the scout in decided disapprobation of his opinion. "I rubbed the bark off a limb, perhaps, but the creature leaped the longer for it. A rifle bullet acts like a running animal when it barks him, much the same as one of your spurs on a horse. That is, it quickens motion and puts life into the flesh instead of taking it away. But when it cuts the ragged hole after a bound or two, there is commonly a stagnation of further leaping, be it Indian or be it deer." "We are 4 able bodies to 1 wounded man." "Is life grievous to you?" interrupted the scout. "Yon red devil would draw you within swing of the tomahawks of his comrades before you were heated in the chase. It was an unthoughtful act in a man who has so often slept with the war-whoop ringing in the air, to let off his piece within sound of ambushment. But then it was a natural temptation. 'Twas very natural. Come, friends, let us move our station, and in such fashion, too, as will throw the cunning of a Mingo on a wrong scent. or our scalps will be drying in the wind in front of Montcalm's marquee, again this hour tomorrow." This appalling declaration, which the scout uttered with the cool assurance of a man who fully comprehended, while he did not fear to face the danger, served to remind Hayward of the importance of the charge with which he himself had been entrusted. Glancing his eyes around with a vain effort to pierce the gloom that was thickening beneath the leafy arches of the forest, he felt as if cut off from human aid. His unresisting companions would soon lie at the entire mercy of those barbarous enemies, who, like beasts of prey, only waited till the gathering darkness might render their blows more fatally certain. His awakened imagination, deluded by the deceptive light, converted each waving bush or the fragment of some fallen tree into human forms, and 20 times he fancied he could distinguish the horrid visages of his lurking foes peering from their hiding places in never-ceasing watchfulness of the movements of his party. Looking upward, he found that the thin fleecy clouds, which evening had painted on the blue sky, were already losing their faintest tints of rose color, while the embedded stream which glided past the spot where he stood was to be traced only by the dark boundary of its wooded banks. "What is to be done?" he said, feeling the utter helplessness of doubt in such a pressing strait. "Desert me not, for God's sake. Remain to defend those I escort, and freely name your own reward." His companions, who conversed apart in the language of their tribe, heeded not his sudden and earnest appeal. Though their dialogue was maintained in low and cautious sounds, but little above a whisper, Hayward, who now approached, could easily distinguish the earnest tones of the younger warrior from the more deliberate speeches of his seniors. It was evident that they debated on the propriety of some measure that nearly concerned the welfare of the travelers. Yielding to his powerful interest in the subject, and impatient of a delay that seemed fraught with so much additional danger, Hayward drew still nigher to the dusky group, with an intention of making his offers of compensation more definite, when the white man, motioning with his hand as if he conceded the disputed point, turned away, saying in a sort of soliloquy, and in the English tongue, "Uncas is right. It would not be the act of men to leave such harmless things to their fate, even though it breaks up the harboring place forever. If you would save these tender blossoms from the fangs of the worst serpents, gentlemen, you have neither time to lose nor resolution to throw away." "How can such a wish be doubted? Have I not already offered—" "Offer your prayers to him who can give us wisdom to circumvent the cunning of the devils who fill these woods," calmly interrupted the scout. "But spare your offers of money, which neither you may live to realize nor I to profit by. These Mohicans and I will do what man's thoughts can invent to keep such flowers which, though so sweet, were never made for the wilderness from harm, and that without hope of any other recompense but such as God always gives to upright dealings. First, you must promise 2 things, both in your own name and for your friends, or without serving you, we shall only injure ourselves." "Name them." "The one is to be still as these sleeping woods, let what will happen, and the other is to keep the place where we shall take you forever a secret from all mortal men." "I will do my utmost to see both these conditions fulfilled." "Then follow, for we are losing moments that are as precious as the heart's blood to a stricken deer." Hayward could distinguish the impatient gesture of the scout through the increasing shadows of the evening, and he moved in his footsteps swiftly toward the place where he had left the remainder of the party. When they rejoined the expecting and anxious females, he briefly acquainted them with the conditions of their new guide, and with the necessity that existed for their hushing every apprehension in instant and serious exertions. Although his alarming communication was not received without much secret terror by the listeners, his earnest and impressive manner, aided perhaps by the nature of the danger, succeeded in bracing their nerves to undergo some unlooked-for and unusual trial. Silently and without a moment's delay, they permitted him to assist them from their saddles, and when they descended quickly to the water's edge, where the scout had collected the rest of the party, more by the agency of expressive gestures than by any use of words. "What to do with these dumb creatures?" muttered the white man, on whom the sole control of their future movements appeared to devolve. "It would be time lost to cut their throats and cast them into the river, and to leave them here would be to tell the Mingoes that they have not far to seek to find their owners." "Then give them their bridles and let them range in the woods," Hayward ventured to suggest. "No, it would be better to mislead the imps and make them believe they must equal a horse's speed to run down their chase. Aye, aye, that will blind their fireballs of eyes. Chingach, hitch! What stirs in the bush? The colt. That colt at least must die," muttered the scout, grasping at the mane of the nimble beast, which easily eluded his hand. "Uncas, your arrows!" "Hold!" exclaimed the proprietor of the condemned animal aloud, without regard to the whispering tones used by the others. "Spare the foal of Miriam. It is the comely offspring of a faithful dame, and would willingly injure naught." "When men struggle for the single life God has given them," said the scout sternly, "even their own kind seem no more than the beast of the wood. If you speak again, I shall leave you at the mercy of the Maquas. Draw to your arrow's head, Uncas. We have no time for second blows." The low, muttering sounds of his threatening voice were still audible when the wounded foal, first rearing on its hinder legs, plunged forward to its knees. It was met by Chingachgook, whose knife passed across its throat quicker than thought, and then, precipitating the motions of the struggling victim, he had dashed into the river, down whose stream it glided away, gasping audibly for breath with its ebbing life. This deed of apparent cruelty, but of real necessity, fell upon the spirits of the travelers like a terrific warning of the peril in which they stood, heightened as it was by the calm though steady resolution of the actors in the scene. The sisters shuddered and clung closer to each other, while Hayward instinctively laid his hand on one of his pistols he had just drawn from their holsters, as he placed himself between his charge and those dense shadows that seemed to draw an impenetrable veil before the bosom of the forest. The Indians, however, hesitated not a moment, but taking the bridles, they led the frightened and reluctant horses into the bed of the river. At a short distance from the shore they turned, and were soon concealed by the projection of the bank, under the brow of which they moved, in a direction opposite to the course of the waters. In the meantime the scout drew a canoe of bark from its place of concealment beneath some low bushes, whose branches were waving with the eddies of the current, into which he silently motioned for the females to enter. They complied without hesitation, though many a fearful and anxious glance was thrown behind them, toward the thickening gloom, which now lay like a dark barrier along the margin of the stream. So soon as Cora and Alice were seated, the scout, without regarding the element, directed Hayward to support one side of the frail vessel, and posting himself at the other, they bore it up against the stream, followed by the dejected owner of the dead foal. In this manner they proceeded for many rods in a silence that was only interrupted by the rippling of the water, as its eddies played around them, or the low dash made by their own cautious footsteps. Hayward yielded the guidance of the canoe implicitly to the scout, who approached or receded from the shore to avoid the fragments of rocks or deeper parts of the river, with a readiness that showed his knowledge of the route they held. Occasionally he would stop, and in the midst of a breathing stillness that the dull but increasing roar of the waterfall only served to render more impressive, he would listen with painful intentness, to catch any sounds that might arise from the slumbering forest. When assured that all was still, and unable to detect even by the aid of his practised senses any sign of his approaching foes, he would deliberately resume his slow and guarded progress. At length they reached a point in the river where the roving eye of Hayward became riveted on a cluster of black objects, collected at a spot where the high banks threw a deeper shadow than usual on the dark waters. Hesitating to advance, he pointed out the place to the attention of his companion. "Aye," returned the composed scout, "the Indians have hid the beast with the judgment of natives. Water leaves no trail, and an owl's eyes would be blinded by the darkness of such a hole." The whole party was soon reunited, and another consultation was held between the scout and his new comrades, during which they whose fates depended on the faith and ingenuity of these unknown foresters had a little leisure to observe their situation more minutely. The river was confined between high and cragged rocks, one of which impended above the spot where the canoe rested. As these again were surmounted by tall trees, which appeared to totter on the brows of the precipice, it gave the stream the appearance of running through a deep and narrow dell. All beneath the fantastic limbs and ragged tree-tops, which were here and there dimly painted against the starry zenith, lay alike in shadowed obscurity. Behind them, the curvature of the bank soon bounded the view by the same dark and wooded outline. But in front, and apparently at no great distance, the water seemed piled against the heavens, whence it tumbled into caverns, out of which issued those sullen sounds which had loaded the evening atmosphere. It seemed in truth to be a spot devoted to seclusion, and the sisters imbibed a soothing impression of security as they gazed upon its romantic though not unappalling beauties. A general movement among their conductors, however, soon recalled them from a contemplation of the wild charms that night had assisted to lend the place, to a painful sense of their real peril. The horses had been secured to some scattering shrubs that grew in the fissures in the rocks, where, standing in the water, they were left to pass the night. The scout directed Hayward and his disconsolate fellow-travelers to seat themselves in the forward end of the canoe, and took possession of the other himself, as erect and steady as if he floated in a vessel of much firmer materials. The Indians warily retraced their steps toward the place they had left, when the scout, placing his pole against a rock, by a powerful shove, sent his frail bark directly into the turbulent stream. For many minutes the struggle between the light bubble in which they floated and the swift current was severe and doubtful. Forbidden to stir even a hand, and almost afraid to breathe lest they should expose the frail fabric to the fury of the stream, the passengers watched the glancing waters in feverish suspense. 20 times they thought the whirling eddies were sweeping them to destruction, when the master hand of their pilot would bring the bows of the canoe to stem the rapid. Along a vigorous, and as it appeared to the females, a desperate effort closed the struggle. Just as Alice veiled her eyes in horror under the impression that they were about to be swept within the vortex at the foot of the cataract, the canoe floated stationary at the side of a flat rock that lay on a level with the water. "Where are we, and what is to be done?" demanded Hayward, perceiving that the exertions of the scout had ceased. "You are at the foot of Glenn's," returned the other, speaking aloud, without fear of consequences within the roar of the cataract, "and the next thing is to make a steady landing, lest the canoe upset, and you should go down again the hard road we have travelled, faster than you came up. 'Tis a hard rift to stem, when the river is a little swelled, and 5 is an unnatural number to keep dry in a hurry-scurry with a little birchen bark and gum. There, go you all on the rock, and I will bring up the Mohicans with the venison. A man had better sleep without his scalp than famish in the midst of plenty." His passengers gladly complied with these directions. As the last foot touched the rock, the canoe whirled from its station, when the tall form of the scout was seen, for an instant, gliding above the waters before it disappeared in the impenetrable darkness that rested on the bed of the river. Left by their guide, the travelers remained a few minutes in helpless ignorance, afraid even to move among the broken rocks, lest a false step should precipitate them down some one of the many deep and roaring caverns into which the water seemed to tumble on every side of them. Their suspense, however, was soon relieved, for, aided by the skill of the natives, the canoe shot back into the eddy, and floated again at the side of the low rock, before they thought the scout had time to even rejoin his companions. "We are now fortified, garrisoned, and provisioned," cried Hayward cheerfully, "and may set Montcalm and his allies at defiance. How now, my vigilant sentinel, can see anything of those you call the Iroquois on the mainland?" "I call them Iroquois because to me every native who speaks a foreign tongue is accounted an enemy, though he may pretend to serve the king. If Webb wants faith and honesty in an Indian, let him bring out the tribes of the Delawares, and send these greedy and lying Mohawks and Oneidas with their 6 nations of varlets where in nature they belong, among the French." "We should then exchange a warlike for a useless friend? I have heard that Delawares have laid aside the hatchet, and are content to be called women." "Aye, shame on the Hollanders and Iroquois who circumvented them by their deviltries into such a treaty. But I have known them for 20 years, and I call him liar that says cowardly blood runs in the veins of a Delaware. You have driven their tribes from the seashore, and would now believe what their enemies say, that you may sleep at night upon an easy pillow. No, no, to me every Indian who speaks a foreign tongue is an Iroquois, whether the castle of his tribe be in Canada or be in York." Footnote: the principal villages of the Indians are still called castles by the whites of New York. Oneida Castle is no more than a scattered hamlet, but the name is in general use. End footnote. Hayward, perceiving the stubborn adherence of the scout to the cause of his friends the Delawares or Mohicans, for they were the branch of the same numerous people, was likely to prolong a useless discussion, changed the subject. "Treaty or no treaty, I know full well that your 2 companions are brave and cautious warriors. Have they heard or seen anything of our enemies?" "An Indian is a mortal to be felt afore he is seen," returned the scout, ascending the rock and throwing the deer carelessly down. "I trust to other signs than such as come in at the eye, when I am outlying on the trail of the Mingoes." "Do your ears tell you that they have traced our retreat?" "I should be sorry to think they had, though this is a spot that stout courage might hold for a smart scrimmage. I will not deny, however, that the horses cowered when I passed them, as though they scented the wolves, and a wolf is a beast that is apt to hover about an Indian ambushment, craving the offals of the deer the savages kill." "You forget the buck at your feet. Or may we not owe their visit to the dead colt? Ha! What noise is that?" "Poor Miriam," murmured the stranger, "thy foal is foreordained to become prey to ravenous beast." Then suddenly lifting up his voice amid the eternal din of the waters, he sang aloud, "Firstborn of Egypt, smite did he, of mankind and of beast also. O Egypt, wonder sent midst thee, O Pharaoh and his servants too." "The death of the colt sits heavy on the heart of its owner," said the scout, "but it's a good sign to see a man account upon his dumb friends. He has the religion of the matter, in believing what is to happen will happen, and with such a consolation it won't be long before he submits to the rationality of killing a 4-footed beast to save the lives of human men. It may be as you say," he continued, reverting to the purport of Hayward's last remark, "and the greater the reason why we should cut our stakes and let the carcass drive down the stream, or we shall have the pack howling along the cliffs, begrudging every mouthful we swallow. Besides, though the Delaware tongue is the same as a book to the Iroquois, the cunning varlets are quick enough at understanding the reason of a wolf's howl." The scout, while making his remarks, was busied in collecting certain necessary implements. As he concluded, he moved silently by the group of travelers, accompanied by the Mohicans, who seemed to comprehend his intentions with instinctive readiness. when the whole three disappeared in succession, seeming to vanish against the dark face of a perpendicular rock that rose to the height of a few yards, within as many feet of the water's edge. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Quote, "Those strains that once did sweet in Zion glide, he wills apportion with judicious care. And let us worship God, he says, with solemn air." Unquote. Burns. Hayward and his female companions witnessed this mysterious movement with secret uneasiness, for though the conduct of the white man had hitherto been above reproach, his rude equipments, blunt address, and strong antipathies, together with the character of his silent associates, were all causes for exciting distrust in minds that had been so recently alarmed by Indian treachery. The stranger alone disregarded the passing incidents. He seated himself on a projection of the rocks, whence he gave no other signs of consciousness than by the struggles of his spirit, as manifested in the frequent and heavy sighs. Smothered voices were next heard, as though men called to each other in the bowels of the earth, when a sudden light flashed upon those without and laid bare the much-prized secret of the place. At the further extremity of a narrow, deep cavern in the rock, whose length appeared much extended by the perspective and the nature of the light by which it was seen, was seated the scout, holding a blazing knot of pine. The strong glare of the fire fell full upon his sturdy, weather-beaten countenance and forest attire, lending an air of romantic wildness to the aspect of an individual who, seen by the sober light of day, would have exhibited the peculiarities of a man remarkable for the strangeness of his dress, the iron-like inflexibility of his frame, and the singular compound of quick, vigilant sagacity and of exquisite simplicity that by turns usurped the possession of his muscular features. At a little distance in advance stood Uncas, his whole person thrown powerfully into view. The travelers anxiously regarded the upright, flexible figure of the young Mohican, graceful and unrestrained in the attitudes and movements of nature, though his person was more than usually screened by a green and fringed hunting shirt like that of the white man. There was no concealment of his dark, glancing, fearless eye, alike terrible and calm, the bold outline of his high, haughty features, pure in their native red, or to the dignified elevation of his receding forehead, together with all the finest proportions of a noble head, bared to the generous scalping tuft. It was the first opportunity possessed by Duncan and his companions to view the marked lineaments of either of their Indian attendants, and each individual of the party felt relieved from a burden of doubt, as the proud and determined, though wild expression of the features of the young warrior forced itself on their notice. They felt it might be a being partially benighted in the veil of ignorance, but it could not be one who would willingly devote his rich natural gifts to the purpose of wanton treachery. The ingenuous Alice gazed at his free air and proud carriage, as she would have looked upon some precious relic of the Grecian chisel to which life had been imparted by the invention of a miracle, while Hayward, though accustomed to see the perfection of form which abounds among the uncorrupted natives, openly expressed his admiration at such an unblemished specimen of the noblest proportions of man. "I could sleep in peace," whispered Alice in reply, "with such a fearless and generous-looking youth for my sentinel. Surely, Duncan, those cruel murders, those terrific scenes of torture of which we read and hear so much, are never acted in the presence of such as he." "This is certainly a rare and brilliant instance of those natural qualities in which these peculiar people are said to excel," he answered. "I agree with you, Alice, in thinking that such a front and eye were formed rather to intimidate than to deceive. But let us not practice a deception upon ourselves by expecting any other exhibition of what we esteem virtue than according to the fashion of the savage. As bright examples of great qualities are but too uncommon among Christians, so they are singular and solitary with Indians, though for the honor of our common nature, neither are incapable of producing them. Let us then hope that this Mohican may not disappoint our wishes, but prove what his looks assert him to be, a brave and constant friend." "Now Major Hayward speaks as Major Hayward should," said Cora. "Who that looks at this creature of nature remembers the shade of his skin?" A short and apparently an embarrassed silence succeeded this remark, which was interrupted by the scout calling to them aloud to enter. "This fire begins to show too bright a flame," he continued, as they complied, "and might light the Mingoes to our undoing. Uncas, drop the blanket and show the knaves its dark side. This is not such a supper as a major of the Royal Americans has right to expect, but I've known stout detachment of the corps glad to eat their venison raw, and without a relish too." Footnote: in vulgar parlance, the condiments of a repast are called by the American a relish, substituting the thing for its effect. These provincial terms are frequently put in the mouths of the speakers, according to their several conditions in life. Most of them are of local use, and others quite peculiar to the particular class of men to which the character belongs. In the present instance, the scout uses the word with immediate reference to the salt, with which his own party was so fortunate as to be provided. End footnote. Here, you see, we have plenty of salt, and can make a quick broil. There's fresh sassafras boughs for the ladies to sit on, which may not be as proud as their mahogany chairs, but which sends up a sweeter flavor than the skin of any hog can do, be it of Guinea or be it of any other land. Come, friend, don't be mournful for the colt. 'Twas an innocent thing, and had not seen much hardship. Its death will save the creature many a sore back and weary foot." Uncas did as the other had directed, and when the voice of Hawkeye ceased, the roar of the cataract sounded like the rumbling of distant thunder. "Are we quite safe in this cavern?" demanded Hayward. "Is there no danger of surprise? A single-armed man at its entrance would hold us at his mercy." A spectral-looking figure stalked out of the darkness behind the scout, and seizing a blazing brand, held it toward the further extremity of their place of retreat. Alice uttered a faint shriek, and even Cora rose to her feet as this appalling object moved into the light, but a single word from Hayward calmed them, with the assurance it was only their attendant, Chingachgook, who, lifting another blanket, discovered that the cavern had two outlets. Then, holding the brand, he crossed a deep, narrow chasm in the rocks, which ran at right angles with the passage they were in, but which, unlike that, was open to the heavens, and entered another cave, answering to the description of the first in every essential particular. "Such old foxes as Chingachgook and myself are not often caught in a barrow with one hole," said Hawkeye, laughing. "You can easily see the cunning of the place. The rock is black limestone, which everyone knows is soft. It makes no uncomfortable pillow where brush and pine wood is scarce. Well, the fall was once a few hundred yards below us, and I dare to say was in its time as regular and as handsome a sheet of water as any along the Hudson. But old age is a great injury to good looks, as these sweet young ladies have yet to learn. The place is sadly changed. These rocks are full of cracks, and in some places they are softer than at othersome, and the water has worked out deep hollows for itself until it has fallen back some 100 feet, breaking here and wearing there, until the falls have neither shape nor consistency." "In what part of them are we?" asked Hayward. "Why, we are nigh the spot that Providence first placed them at, but where it seems they were too rebellious to stay. The rock proved softer on each side of us, and so they left the center of the river bare and dry, first working out these two little holes for us to hide in." "We are on an island?" "Aye, there are falls on two sides of us, and the river above and below. If you had daylight, it would be worth the trouble to step on the height of this rock, and look at the perversity of the water. It falls by no rule at all. Sometimes it leaps, sometimes it tumbles. There it skips, here it shoots. In one place 'tis white as snow, and in another 'tis green as grass. Hereabouts it pitches into deep hollows that rumble and crush the earth, and thereaways it ripples and sings like a brook, fashioning whirlpools and gullies in the old stone, as if 'twas no harder than trodden clay. The whole design of the river seems disconcerted. First it runs smoothly, as if meaning to go down the descent as things were ordered. Then it angles about, and faces the shores, nor are there places wanting where it looks backward, as if unwilling to leave the wilderness to mingle with the salt. Ay, lady, the fine cobweb-looking cloth you wear at your throat is coarse and like a fish-net. To the little spots I can show you where the river fabricates all sorts of images, as if, having broke loose from order, it would try its hand at everything. And yet, what does it amount to? After the water has been suffered so to have its will for a time, like a headstrong man, it is gathered together by the hand that made it, and a few rods below you may see it all, flowing on steadily toward the sea, as was foreordained from the first foundation of the earth. While his auditors received a cheering assurance of the security of their place of concealment from this untutored description of glens, they were much inclined to judge differently from Hawkeye of its wild beauties. Footnote: Glens Falls are on the Hudson, some 40 or 50 miles above the head of tide, or that place where the river becomes navigable for sloops. The description of this picturesque and remarkable little cataract, as given by the scout, is sufficiently correct, though the application of the water to uses in civilized life has materially injured its beauties. The rocky island and the two caverns are known to every traveler, since the former sustains the pier of a bridge, which is now thrown across the river immediately above the fall. In explanation of the taste of Hawkeye, it should be remembered that men always prize that most which is least enjoyed. Thus, in a new country, the woods and other objects which in an old country would be maintained at great cost are got rid of, simply with a view of improving, as it is called. End footnote. They were not in a situation to suffer their thoughts to dwell on the charms of natural objects, and, as the scout had not found it necessary to cease his culinary labors while he spoke, unless to point out with a broken fork the direction of some particularly obnoxious point in the rebellious stream, they now suffered their attention to be drawn to the necessary though more vulgar consideration of their supper. The repast, which was greatly aided by the addition of a few delicacies that Hayward had the precaution to bring with him when they left their horses, was exceedingly refreshing to the weary party. Uncas acted as attendant to the females, performing all the little offices within his power, with a mixture of dignity and anxious grace, that served to amuse Hayward, who well knew that it was an utter innovation on the Indian customs, which forbid their warriors to descend to any menial employment, especially in favor of their women. As the rites of hospitality were, however, considered sacred among them, this little departure from the dignity of manhood excited no audible comment. Had there been one sufficiently disengaged to become a close observer, he might have fancied that the services of the young chief were not entirely impartial; that, while he tendered to Alice the gourd of sweet water, and the venison in a trencher, neatly carved from the knot of a pepperidge, with sufficient courtesy, in performing the same offices to her sister, his dark eye lingered on her rich, speaking countenance. Once or twice he was compelled to speak, to command her attention of those he served. In such cases he made use of English, broken and imperfect, but sufficiently intelligible, and which he rendered so mild and musical by his deep guttural voice, that it never failed to cause both ladies to look up in admiration and astonishment. In the course of these civilities a few sentences were exchanged, that served to establish the appearance of an amicable intercourse between the parties. In the meanwhile, the gravity of Chingachgook remained immovable. He had seated himself more within the circle of light, where the frequent uneasy glances of his guest were better enabled to separate the natural expression of his face from the artificial terrors of the war-paint. They found a strong resemblance between father and son, with the difference that might be expected from age and hardships. The fierceness of his countenance now seemed to slumber, and in its place was to be seen the quiet, vacant composure which distinguishes an Indian warrior when his faculties are not required for any of the greater purposes of his existence. It was, however, easy to be seen, by the occasional gleams that shot across his swarthy visage, that it was only necessary to arouse his passions in order to give full effect to the terrific device which he had adopted to intimidate his enemies. On the other hand, the quick roving eye of the scout seldom rested. He ate and drank with an appetite that no sense of danger could disturb, but his vigilance seemed never to desert him. 20 times the gourd of the venison was suspended before his lips, while his head was turned aside, as though he listened to some distant and distrusted sounds. A movement that never failed to recall his guest from regarding the novelties of their situation to a recollection of the alarming reasons that had driven them to seek it. As these frequent pauses were never followed by any remark, the momentary uneasiness they created quickly passed away, and for a time was forgotten. "Come, friend," said Hawkeye, drawing out a keg from beneath a cover of leaves toward the close of the repast, and addressing the stranger who sat at his elbow, doing great justice to his culinary skill. "Try a little spruce. 'Twill wash away all thoughts of the colt, and quicken the life in your bosom. I drink to our better friendship, hoping that a little horseflesh may leave no heart-burnings atween us. How do you name yourself?" "Gamut, David Gamut," returned the singing master, preparing to wash down his sorrows in a powerful draught of the woodsman's high-flavored and well-laced compound. "A very good name, and, I dare say, handed down from honest forefathers. I am an admirator of names, though the Christian fashions fall far below savage customs in this particular. The biggest coward I ever knew was called Lion, and his wife Patience would scold you out of hearing in less time than a hunted deer would run a rod. With an Indian, 'tis a matter of conscience what he calls himself. He generally is. Not that Chingachgook, which signifies big sarpent, is really a snake, big or little, but that he understands the windings and turnings of human nature, and is silent and strikes his enemies when they least expect him. What may be your calling?" "I am an unworthy instructor in the art of psalmody." "And I teach singing to the youths of the Connecticut levee." "You might be better employed. The young hounds go laughing and singing too much already through the woods, when they ought not to breathe louder than the fox in his cover. Can you use the smooth-bore, or handle the rifle?" "Praise be to God, I have never had occasion to meddle with murderous implements." "Perhaps you understand the compass, and lay down the watercourses and mountains of the wilderness on paper, in order that they who follow may find places by their given names?" "I practice no such employment." "You have a pair of legs that might make a long path seem short. You journey sometimes, I fancy, with tidings for the general?" "Never. I follow no other than my own high vocation, which is instruction in sacred music." "'Tis a strange calling," muttered Hawkeye, with an inward laugh, "to go through life like a catbird, mocking all the ups and downs that may happen to come out of other men's throats. Well, friend, I suppose it is your gift, and mustn't be denied any more than if 'twas shooting or some other better inclination. Let us hear what you can do in that way. 'Twill be a friendly manner of saying good night, for 'tis time that these ladies should be getting strength for a hard and long push in the pride of the morning, afore the Maquas are stirring." "With joyful pleasure do I consent," said David, adjusting his iron-rimmed spectacles, and producing his beloved little volume, which he immediately tendered to Alice. "What can be more fitting and consolatory than to offer up evening praise, after a day of such exceeding jeopardy?" Alice smiled, but regarding Hayward, she blushed and hesitated. "Indulge yourself," he whispered. "Ought not the suggestion of the worthy namesake of the psalmist to have its weight at such a moment?" Encouraged by his opinion, Alice did what her pious inclinations and her keen relish for gentle sounds had before so strongly urged. The book was opened at a hymn not ill adapted to their situation, and in which the poet, no longer goaded by his desire to expel the inspired king of Israel, had discovered some chastened and respectable powers. Cora betrayed a disposition to support her sister, and the sacred song proceeded, after the indispensable preliminaries of the pitch-pipe, and the tune had been duly attended by the methodical David. The air was solemn and slow. At times it rose to the fullest compass of the rich voices of the females, who hung over their little book in holy excitement, and again it sank so low that the rushing of the waters ran through their melody like a hollow accompaniment. The natural taste and true ear of David governed and modified the sounds to suit the confined cavern, every crevice and cranny of which was filled with the thrilling notes of their flexible voices. The Indians riveted their eyes on the rocks, and listened with an attention that seemed to turn them into stone. But the scout, who had placed his chin in his hand with an expression of cold indifference, gradually suffered his rigid features to relax, until, as verse succeeded verse, he felt his iron nature subdued, while his recollection was carried back to boyhood, when his ears had been accustomed to listen to similar sounds of praise in the settlements of the colony. His roving eyes began to moisten, and before the hymn was ended, scalding tears rolled out of fountains that had long seemed dry, and followed each other down those cheeks that had oftener felt the storms of heaven than any testimonials of weakness. The singers were dwelling on one of those low dying chords, which the ear devours with such greedy rapture, as if conscious that it was about to lose them, when a cry that seemed neither human nor earthly rose in the outward air, penetrating not only the recesses of the cavern, but to the inmost hearts of all who heard it. It was followed by a stillness, apparently as deep as if the waters had been checked in their furious progress at such a horrid and unusual interruption. "What is it?" murmured Alice, after a few moments of terrible suspense. "What is it?" repeated Hayward aloud. Neither Hawkeye nor the Indians made any reply. They listened, as if expecting the sound would be repeated, with a manner that expressed their own astonishment. At length they spoke together earnestly in the Delaware language, when Uncas, passing by the inner and most concealed aperture, cautiously left the cavern. When he had gone, the scout first spoke in English. "What it is or what it is not, none here can tell, though two of us have ranged the wood for more than 30 years. I did believe there was no cry that Indian or beast could make that my ears had not heard. But this is proof that I was only a vain and conceited mortal." "Was it not, then, the shout warriors make when they wish to intimidate their enemies?" asked Cora, who stood drawing her veil about her person, with a calmness to which her agitated sister was a stranger. No, this was bad and shocking, and had a sort of unhuman sound, but when you once hear the war-whoop, you will never mistake it for anything else. Well, Uncas, speaking in the Delaware to the young chief as he re-entered, what see you? Do our lights shine through the blankets? The answer was short, and apparently decided, being given in the same tongue. "There is nothing to be seen without," continued Hawkeye, shaking his head in discontent, "and our hiding-place is still in darkness. Pass into the other cave, you that need it, and seek for sleep, We must be afoot long before the sun, and make the most of our time to get to Edward while the Mingoes are still taking their morning nap." Cora set the example of compliance, with a steadiness that taught the more timid Alice the necessity of obedience. Before leaving the place, however, she whispered a request to Duncan, that he would follow. Uncas raised the blanket for the passage, and as the sisters turned to thank him for his active attention, they saw the scout seated again before the dying embers, with his face resting on his hands, in a manner which showed how deeply he brooded on the unaccountable interruption which had broken their evening devotions. Hayward took with him a blazing knot, which threw a dim light through the narrow vista of their new apartment. Placing it in a favorable position, he joined the females, who now found themselves alone with him for the first time since they had left the friendly ramparts of Fort Edward.
"Leave us not, Duncan,"
said Alice.
"We cannot sleep in such a place as this, with that horrid cry still ringing in our ears."
"First, let us examine into the security of our fortress," he answered, "and then we will speak of rest." He approached the further end of the cavern, to an outlet which, like the others, was concealed by blankets, and, removing the thick screen, breathed the fresh and reviving air from the cataract. One arm of the river flowed through a deep, narrow ravine, which its current had worn in the soft rock directly beneath his feet, forming an effectual defense, as he believed, against any danger from that quarter. The water, a few rods above them, plunging, glancing, and sweeping along in its most violent and broken manner. "Nature has made an impenetrable barrier on this side," he continued, pointing down the perpendicular declivity into the dark current before he dropped the blanket. "And as you know that good men and true are on guard in front, I see no reason why the advice of our honest host should be disregarded. I am certain Cora will join me in saying that sleep is necessary to you both."
"Cora may submit to the justice of your opinion, though she cannot put it in practice," returned the elder sister, who had placed herself by the side of Alice on a couch of sassafras. "There would be other causes to chase away sleep, though we had been spared the shock of this mysterious noise. Ask yourself, Hayward, can daughters forget the anxiety a father must endure, whose children lodge he knows not where or how in such a wilderness, and in the midst of so many perils? He is a soldier, and knows how to estimate the chances of the woods. He is a father, and cannot deny his nature. How kind has he ever been to all my follies! How tender and indulgent to all my wishes!" sobbed Alice. "We have been selfish, sister, in urging our visit at such hazard. I have been rash in pressing his consent in a moment of such embarrassment, that I would have proved to him that however others might neglect him in his strait, his children, at least, were faithful."
"When he heard of your arrival at Edward," said Hayward kindly, "there was a powerful struggle in his bosom between fear and love, though the latter, heightened if possible by so long a separation, quickly prevailed. It is the spirit of my noble-minded Cora that leads them, Duncan," he said, "and I would not balk it. Would to God that he who holds the honor of our royal master in his guardianship would show but half her firmness."
"And did he not speak of me, Hayward?" demanded Alice with jealous affection. "Surely he forgot not altogether his little Elsie."
"That were impossible," returned the young man. "He called you by 1,000 endearing epithets that I may not presume to use, but to the justice of which I can warmly testify. Once, indeed, he said—" Duncan ceased speaking, for while his eyes were riveted on those of Alice, who had turned toward him with the eagerness of filial affection, to catch his words, the same strong, horrid cry as before filled the air and rendered him mute. A long, breathless silence succeeded, during which each looked at the others in fearful expectation of hearing the sound repeated. At length the blanket was slowly raised, and the scout stood in the aperture with a countenance whose firmness evidently began to give way before a mystery that seemed to threaten some danger, against which all his cunning and experience might prove to no avail. End of chapter 6.